Alright, so today there's only one character to talk about, and that is of course Mast. In today's video, what I will be doing is reviewing this character, talking about how good she is and when she can be useful. I also want to give you guys everything you need to know about building Mast and how to use her efficiently, so that you can hit the ground running when you do end up getting her. Mast is the newest burst type to support from the Elysian line of units. She is an SMG user and she also has the electric element. She is basically a character that can give your team offensive buffs while also decreasing your enemy's defense. So to actually review this character, let's begin by talking about her skills and what she does. Her skill 1 activates whenever she does 2 critical hits. This applies a defense reduction effect that stacks up to 50 times and will last for 3 seconds. Additionally, this also has another effect that activates when her HP falls below 70%. This will apply to Mast and 2 of her other allies with the highest attack, giving them a critical damage buff. The second effect is pretty straightforward, but there's actually something interesting about this which we will cover later in this video. But to break down the rest of this ability, we have to take a look at how stack decay works, go over some of her frame data, and also talk about the pros and cons. Just in case you are not familiar with how stack decay works, all of the stacks of any effect will basically share the same cooldown, which means that you have to keep on adding on a new stack within the effect duration. So for Mast to be able to keep this effect up, she has to be able to do 2 critical hits within the 3-second duration, which on paper should be easy enough. She has a base critical chance of 15%, she has a base maximum ammo capacity of 120, which takes her roughly around 5.5 seconds to unload, and she has an estimated reload time of 1.5 seconds, and a little bit lower than that if you have the Resilience Cube. The Resilience Cube is definitely a must-have, because you would want Mast to be attacking the enemy as frequently as possible, so that you can keep the stacks on her skill 1. The good thing about her skill 1 is that it's really good against the different bosses and tankier enemies. Being able to reduce the enemy's defense obviously means that you are overall increasing your team's damage output. But with that said, this has a couple of downsides. You won't be able to keep this at maximum stacks if the enemy has a shield, can be invulnerable, goes off screen, or can simply stun your characters. There is also a new silence mechanic which you will encounter during the chapter 23 final boss, but I'm not entirely sure if that also affects passive skills. As of making this guide video, I was only able to try Mast against a few bosses, mainly against Chatterbox, Modernia, and Land Eater. When I went up against Chatterbox, I was actually surprised that I was able to consistently keep the 50 stacks even with Chatterbox doing the jumping attack. It did require a bit of finessing and proper timing because I had to make sure that I only reload immediately after the effect duration was reset. Keeping the stacks against Modernia wasn't a problem for the most part, but as you would imagine, if you break her turrets, she will start teleporting all over the place, so that can be a problem. So at least, when it comes to the interception boss fight, I recommend that you completely ignore the turrets after you break the core. Just focus on taking out the projectiles instead of having to deal with the teleports and more laser attacks. When it comes to Land Eater, this is definitely one of the better scenarios for Mast. Not only because Land Eater is a very easy target for SMG characters, but also because it is actually weak against electric units. So overall, her skill 1 is made for boss fights, and as long as you're able to deal 2 critical hits, at least once every 3 seconds, then you should be able to keep a very high if not a 100% uptime on this passive. Of course, getting more crit rate either from your equipment or other characters can also help Mast get her stacks more consistently. Now when it comes to how good her defense reduction is, I actually compared this to Viper's damage reduction. Both of them have level 4 skills and are very close in terms of combat power. For my testing, I went up against a boss to see how much damage Snow White can do while Mast has 50 stacks on the target, and I repeated the same thing but with Viper instead of Mast. Snow White's burst did slightly more damage when I used Viper. She was able to do roughly 1.5 million damage compared to when Mast had 50 stacks on the enemy, only dealing a little over 1.4 million. But with that said, that is for the non-critical hit. Once I tested out Snow White's critical hit damage, the final outcome was a lot more different. Using Viper, Snow White was able to deal a little over 2 million damage. But when I used Mast, Snow White was dealing 400,000 more damage in comparison. So because of that, Viper might have a slightly better defense reduction, but because Mast can also increase critical damage, your team will be doing more damage in the long run. It's also important to keep in mind that Mast is a character that relies on a pretty high investment. So once you get a higher level on her skill 1 and maybe some defense rolls on her equipment, then she will significantly be better. The advantage that Mast has over the other defense reduction characters is that she has a skill that is very easy to trigger and it also doesn't have a cooldown. So in the right scenarios, Mast will have the higher uptime and just overall better damage boost for your team. I feel like I spent a lot of time just explaining her skill 1, but I really wanted to go over this in depth because this is the core part of her kit. The rest of her skills basically just amplifies this or works in tandem with it. And speaking of, let's move on to her skill 2. This basically increases the critical rate for herself along with 2 other allies with the highest attack. At level 4, this is going to increase their critical rate by 17.14% and it will last for 30 seconds, only activating at the beginning of the fight. So there's not much to say about her skill 2, aside from it helps your DPS characters deal more damage, and it also helps Mast to consistently get more stacks on her skill 1 within that 30-second time frame. So moving on to her burst. At level 4, this is going to increase their max HP by 62.69% of Mast's max HP for 7 seconds, while also increasing their critical damage by 18.32% for the same duration. The additional HP can generally be useful because it increases survivability, but aside from the obvious, this HP increase is actually perfect for triggering passive skills that activate when the character's HP goes below a certain percent. And the best examples for this are Guillotine and Mast herself. For Mast, her skill 1 increases the critical damage for herself and along with 2 other allies when she drops below 70% HP, and Guillotine increases her attack for every 1% of her HP lost, also activating when she goes below 70% HP. So what happens is that because the characters get a higher max HP, that actually counts toward triggering their passive. Take for example Guillotine. After Mast uses her burst, Guillotine's max HP increases by around 700,000, which is putting her current HP at roughly 41% less than her temporary max HP, therefore activating her passive. This is overall really good for activating skills similar to this because it helps you trigger the skill without necessarily going to a dangerously low HP value. But aside from the DPS characters, another decent character to pair with Mast is Jackal. She is able to share the damage between herself and 2 other allies with the highest attack. So in combination with the HP increase from Mast and with the help of a healer, those 3 characters affected by the damage sharing can take more damage overall. Additionally, her burst should be able to double the stack count for her skill 1 every second for 7 seconds. But I have been testing this out for a long time and it seems like this effect is bugged. So depending on how you look at this, it can be both a good or bad thing. It's good in the sense that she will become even better once this actually gets fixed, but this can also be really bad if it's working as intended and there just happened to be a mistranslation or something. So I hope that it ends up being the first one, because if this was actually working, Mast will effectively have a 10-second duration on her stacks, at least whenever she uses her burst. Because knowing how stack decay works, if she is duplicating the stacks every second for 7 seconds, that means that she is repeatedly resetting the cooldown for 7 seconds. And when the 7-second timer ends, she has another 3 seconds before the stacks go away. This opens up the potential to keep the stacks on the enemy even if Mast is not able to hit them, as long as it doesn't take longer than 10 seconds. Now before we move on to talking about how to build Mast and what to prioritize, let's first talk about where she actually shines and why you would even consider pulling for her. So based on her skills, it's crystal clear that she is meant to be a character for boss fights. I would say that she is a character worth considering if you are in the endgame and you're looking to push your score in the solo and union raids. The 2 different raids are what I would personally consider as the endgame for NIKKE. And when you're trying to push your scores in the raid, it's really important to have options. The different bosses you will encounter will be weak against different elements, so having a character with a specific element and role can be very useful. Also remember that characters that have the strong element will be doing 10% more damage, and for some people, that is the difference between whether or not they get to the certain percentile in the rankings. I would definitely recommend pulling for Mast if you don't have that many good options for a Burst 2 support. Mast is going to provide you with buffs that are very useful to any character, unlike some of the other Burst 2 characters that need to be in a specific team to actually get the most value out of. I know that you guys have your own situations in your accounts, so feel free to ask in the comments below and I will be more than happy to answer. So moving on, let's actually talk about the characters that I think works the best with Mast. So the first one we are going to take a look at is Helm. Helm is one of the best characters to pair with Mast because they are both well equipped against boss fights. And the main thing I really like about Helm is that you can basically spam her normal attacks so that she keeps giving Mast more crit rate. This will help Mast get more stacks on her skill 1, so that is overall really good. Not to mention that Helm also gives her team lifesteal, so that lifesteal in combination with the HP increase from Mast will give 3 of your characters a significantly higher survivability during full burst. Moving on, the next character we have is Privity. I'm putting her on the list not only because she is my all-time favorite character, but also because her utility is especially good for Mast. Just like I mentioned before, you would preferably have Mast attacking consistently. So this means that you would want to decrease her reload time as much as possible. So a really good way to do that is to use Privity to get a reload speed buff. Brevity is just a really good universal support, so you can't go wrong with using her. The next character on the list, we have Volume. I feel like Volume is a character that has gotten pretty stagnant when it comes to her teams. She is in this awkward position of being a non-meta character, but also not being one of the best. In the early game, she gets overpowered by N102, and in the late game, she is outshined by Litter and Dorothy. So it can be hard for some people to justify using her if you already have the better units. But pairing up Mast and Volume can actually be really good. Volume has a massive crit rate buff on her burst, so that will really help Mast to get maximum stacks very quickly. This is a combination that I can see myself using for the raids because majority of the time, my top tier burst 1 units are already in other teams. So having Volume as an option to pair with Mast is really good. And lastly, we have Guillotine. I briefly went over this in the skill section, but essentially, Mast lets you temporarily trigger the skills that require the character to be below a certain percent of HP by increasing their max HP. Now for this section, let's actually talk about her skill priorities and equipment. First of all, you would want to prioritize leveling her skill 1 over anything else. As I mentioned before, this is going to be the core part of Mast, so getting a higher defense reduction value on this is very important. Next, you would want to upgrade her burst for more crit damage and more HP, and then you can save her skill 2 for last, because even at level 4, it already gives a pretty decent amount of crit rate. And one more thing is that you won't really get much value out of this ability after 30 seconds, so you're better off prioritizing her other skills. For the Harmony Cube, Resilience is by far the best one. It helps Mast shorten her reload time, making it more likely for you to keep the stacks on her skill 1. In terms of equipment and what stats you actually want to have, I recommend that you go for crit rate, defense, and increase ammo capacity. Getting more crit rate helps her get more stacks consistently, and I would say that around 20% crit rate should be good enough because that puts Mast on 35% crit rate without even factoring in additional crit rate from skills. And then getting more defense is nice because it will directly increase the defense reduction from her skill 1. And lastly, getting as much ammo capacity is also really good so that you can get to maximum stacks without having to reload too many times. So overall, I'm just happy that we finally got a really good Elysian support after a very long time. She is somewhat of a high investment character, but if you put in a fair amount of resources in upgrading her skills and getting decent stats on her equipment, then she will definitely be a really good character for boss fights. With that being said, I hope you found this video useful. And if you did, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.